Hello, welcome to the concluding panel of the event. I'm Izzy again. Hello, and I am delighted to introduce our panelists. I will introduce them not in the order in which they will be presenting, but rather alphabetically as they are listed on the website. Ajay, once again, as the executive director of the Brooklyn Institute and a core faculty member specializing in social and political theory. He holds a PhD from Columbia University, MSc from LSE, and his research focuses on social and political theory, Frankfurt School critical theory, political economy, political ecology, media, religion, and postcolonial studies. Shall I add all of your publications?
Knock yourself out.
He's written for The Guardian, The Nation, The Baffler, N+1, the LA Review of Books, Court, Social Texts, Dialectical Anthropology, The Hedgehog Review, and some other things. And he's currently writing a manuscript on the politics of climate change. Samantha Hill is associate faculty at Brooklyn Institute and the author of Hannah Arendt, out in 2021 from Reaction Books, and Hannah Arendt's poem, which is forthcoming. She's currently writing a book on loneliness for Yale University Press, and you can find her writing in Aeon, the LA Review of Books, Public Seminar, Open Democracy, Theory and Event, Contemporary Political Theory, and a number of other publications. Scrolling down. Oh gosh.
Jodi's up there.
Oh, she's at the top. Oh, there she is. Jodi Dean teaches political theory at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. She's written or edited 14 books, including Crowds and Parties, and Comrade, an essay on political belonging, both out from Verso. Gosh, where's Moira? Moira. These are in fact not listed alphabetically. Oh gosh, okay, hold on. I'll pull up Moira's, which I think is on a separate. I have it.
Okay.
Yeah. Moira Weigel is an assistant professor of communication studies at Northeastern University, a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard Law School, and a founder of Logic magazine. She is the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating, and editor with Ben Tarnoff of Voices from the Valley, Tech Workers Talk About What They Do and How They Do It, out from FSG in 2020. And last but not least, and in fact first to present, Barnaby Raine is an intellectual historian, writing his PhD at Columbia University. His doctoral research seeks to explain the decline of thinking about the end of capitalism from Marx through to debates in 20th century Britain, amid the end of formal empire. He holds master's in history from Columbia and an MA, and a BA in history and politics from Oxford. He has broad interests in the history of social theory and modern political thought, the history of the political left, and methodological questions in intellectual history, as well as theories of contemporary anti-Semitism. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, N+1, and numerous other venues. So without further ado, why don't we go just down the line, starting with Barnaby. You'll have about 10 minutes each. I'll offer a quick kind of preliminary thoughts and offer you a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So Barnaby, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here. And thank you to the Brooklyn Institute for putting on this brilliant event. It's so great to get so many people in a room in New York City to hear about cultural Marxism. If only we could translate from this room to the destruction of Ron DeSantis' campaign and life, that would be even better. I'm going to start with things at quite a level of abstraction so that it's hard to disagree with me, but I hope that panelists will still... My hope is that people will still find a way. And I'm going to read, because when I don't, I waffle uncontrollably, so I waste time. So please forgive me. I want to suggest that one fundamental lesson from the Frankfurt School for critical thinking today is also the site of a very great drawback and a series of deep problems that unfolded for the Frankfurt School from the 1930s to the 1960s. And that is in the category social totality. Lukács begins his great essay on the Marxism of Rosa Luxemburg with the claim that Marxism is defined not by a claim about the primacy of economic motives, but by adopting, quote, the point of view of totality. It's a very famous line. Though capital is a discrete social relation, its peculiarity and its importance to Marx lay in its singular ability to transform whole social worlds, such as the compulsive expansion built into accumulation. Hence, though, these claims from the manifesto, though all previous ruling classes were conservative, capitalists must innovate, and hence capital must create, quote, a world after its own image. The Frankfurt School famously saw the political potency of that claim. Capital was not only a relation of exploitation, of value transfer between workers and capitalists, it was a whole society. And so two things followed. First, understanding capital required understanding such domains as culture and not just the economy. And secondly, the overcoming of capital must involve the transformation of spheres of social life beyond only the direct experience of exploitation. In their 1956 dialogue printed as Towards a New Manifesto, Adorno and Horkheimer take up Marx's claim in the Grundrisse that capital brings us to a threshold it cannot then cross, such as its treadmill dynamic. That is, it creates the possibility of free time amid abundance and of the radically transformed subjectivities involved in living no longer for work, but for life itself. There is today a Marx revival in many forms, and in opposition to liberal identity politics, one sometimes finds stressed as the ostensibly distinctively Marxist claim an emphasis on class, understood economistically, and so an emphasis on money and wealth and its distribution. As Moira Stone put it, Marx was interested in changing the mode of production and not just the mode of distribution. And the Frankfurt School are useful to us for their emphasis on the broad range of productions of power and subjectivity that capital generates and that must therefore be at stake in its Aufhebung. But I think that by 1956, by that chat in which Adorno frets that, quote, the appeal to class won't work anymore, and then he says blankly, we know nothing of Asia, I think that by 1956, some problems had set in for that program announced by Horkheimer 20 years earlier in 1937 in traditional and critical theory. Like Lukács, the early Frankfurt School worked with a conception of totality that Althusser would later term expressive, so that is the whole social formation was a series of mediations or iterations of capital. As Adorno put it in his Introduction to Sociology lectures in 1968, capitalism is the first society, since capital's inbuilt expansionary property ensured that it invaded everything and so gave to the whole social world a coherence by organizing it all around the principle of accumulation. Sometimes that could generate an easy pessimism. Everything is capital. So think, for instance, of the contrast between the culture industry, or just Adorno's notorious comments about jazz, versus Raymond Williams's cultural materialism, in which it was always stressed that cultural life is a sphere of constant negotiation and struggle, not just capital. In Lukács, though, expressive totality was a hopeful claim because the totality produced its own negative, the proletariat. A single subject stood in antithesis to every manifestation of domination, ready to take the reins. That neatness, that revolutionary politics, was possible because the unity of every apparently discrete aspect of the totality, all united under this sign capital, meant they could all be negated by their equally singular antithesis. Now, you might still think like this, some people do, but the career of the Frankfurt School issues a kind of warning against this thinking, I think. In the face of the evident difficulty in the 20th century in mobilizing such a subject in the imperial core, Lukács's optimism gave way to the profound challenge of Adorno's negative dialectics. What if, shorn of Hegelian rules, we no longer assume that every totality need produce a negative, an emancipatory resolution immanent to its dialectic? Perry Anderson famously read defeat as the crucial backdrop for all Western Marxism. But it seems to me that, in fact, something changes around the 1950s. Out of the change, the loss of this faith in the singular antithesis in the totality, which can resolve everything, out of that change, at least three different paths eventually develop. I'll go from like the worst. Habermasian accommodation, where the loss of faith in a singular, totally emancipatory subject ends in the slightly grotesque tragedy of celebrating the European Union. Or, secondly, you can have something like Axel Honneth's assertion in his recent socialism book that the left is a normative project. Here he echoes Jerry Cohen's late turn to utopianism after a loss of faith in a more mechanistic and economistic Marxism than the Frankfurt schools, but one equally premised in Cohen on the guarantee of success. So when you lose that faith, thinkers retreat sometimes into what I think of as a kind of impossible politics, politics without subjects. Lastly, at the left edge, In students of Adorno like Backhaus, and I mentioned Moshe Stone, we find the stress on that passage in Capital where Marx calls capital the dominant subject, now read in some value form theory to write out the very possibility of an antagonistic proletarian subject. All of these, it seems to me, are reactions to a much more historically narrow crisis than their self-presentation as kind of fundamental rethinkings usually suggests. The long divorce of Western labor from consistent universalist and emancipatory praxis amid the power of the nation state, the welfare state, and then neoliberal cruel optimism. It is striking that the most forceful Frankfurt School attempt to engage this challenge in Marcuse's delineation of a plural revolutionary subject encompassing students, the colonized, and those threatened by ecological breakdown, think, for example, of the famous political preface to Eros and Civilization. That emerged from the most committed humanist in the immediate Frankfurt milieu, but it relies for its coherence on something more like Althusser's complex totality, where capital prospers through its association with relatively autonomous structures, and so assaults on each of them might provide openings for the disruption of capital's reproduction, rather than a singular negation, a negation of the negation being communism. This, I think, very compellingly is how Althusser read Lenin's interest in the chain breaking at its weakest link, rather than revolution happening where the proletariat had most ripened and so on. So I want to suggest that the Frankfurt School's conscious conception of totality, call it Hegelian, Lukácsian, expressive, or even orthodox Marxist, if you like, is their worst gift to us now, even as the emphasis on totality is their finest lesson. But I want to close by saying something a bit more hopeful, though very limitedly so, because we're talking about the Frankfurt School, so other than Marcuse, we're not allowed to be too hopeful. So I want to close, I'll speak for too long now, but by suggesting a kind of underground, unorthodox response from the Frankfurt School to the tragic predicament amid the loss of faith in capital's revolutionary antithesis, at least in the imperial core. This is the much noted recovery of theology. I should admit that my own academic interest in this path comes from grappling with the attempt to write a history PhD. Comrades, I do not recommend it. In the writing, I've realized that I think of history. This is partly why I get in trouble, right? I've realized that I don't think of history in Carlo Ginzburg's famous analogy between the historian and the judge, sifting through evidence to find truth. I find myself more compelled by something like an analogy to psychoanalysis, where the analyst doesn't hope to reconstruct the past of the analysand as it really was, or even as it was experienced by the analysand at the time. The analyst's goal is instead to work out how a sense of that past is experienced in the present, not even how the analysand experiences it every day now, but how it surfaces between the analysand and the analyst, because that's all the analyst can actually hope to encounter. What if we thought of the history of the left in this way? We tell historical narrations in order to find the seeds of how they are present for us now. Walter Benjamin put it most famously, to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The goal is to take the fragments and the embers, the shards of past dreams, and the pain, the experience of the pain of their devastation, in order to craft a politics not founded in scientific guarantees, but in something more like storytelling or faith. Only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, and this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. I'm hoping some of you will think that sounds good. Barnaby's such a good word. That's from Walter Benjamin. So Benjamin's famous lines are about commitment to others and to traditions, not about certain outcomes. So it's not even a question of saying, well, let's replace a simple conception of totality where we hope about a total emancipatory subject with a more plural, complex one in which we can find subjects elsewhere. Marcuse tries to find them, Althusser tries to find them. Instead, what we find here is commitment to others and to traditions, a commitment that involves a certainty only that some outcomes must be fought for now. Or, as Adorno puts it, again very famously at the end of Minima Moralia, the only philosophy that can be practiced responsibly in the face of despair is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange this world, that reveal its fissures and crevices, as indigent and distorted as they will one day appear in the messianic light. Out of an orientation to history, then, we get an orientation to politics. It's something like today, Shabbat, which I'm currently disobeying in 1,000 ways. And so I'll now advertise the virtues of Shabbat to you, because hypocrisy is my favorite virtue. The idea of Shabbat, the day of rest, is a prefiguration of the Messianic era of universal rest. It is a recognition that we cannot now, in the present, live like that all the time, but also that we require crystals of the future in the present to sustain our faith. So it's not a claim that we know when the world of Shabbat forever will come. It's not even clear to me whether all Orthodox Jews really believe it ever will. But the orientation to it structures a whole horizon of present practices. This, much like Althusser's late materialism of the encounter, is not an attempt to displace one image of totality with another, which can sustain renewed roadmaps for social transformation. Rather, this is to query the whole confident secular epistemology of roadmaps. It is to say that we do not know when or why or how or even whether hope will come, because we do not know the world fully enough to know that for sure. Only God does. But beauty does come, sometimes unexpectedly. Struggles erupt, kings get beheaded, people fire rockets. And if we lose the commitment to that principle of hope, we end up like Habermas. I didn't think that was remotely provocative. I just thought we all agree that's the worst thing we could possibly do. That's fine. Yeah. As Horkheimer put it in that dialogue in 1956, I love this line. I do not believe that things will turn out well, but the idea that they might is of decisive importance. That, I suggest, is indispensable to the thing that we must salvage most, a grounded and a faithful commitment to socialism today and to miracles.
That's sort of a hard act to follow. I also apologize. I have to read off my device, although it turns out to be appropriate to my subject matter. So as everyone's been saying, I just wanted to add my voice to the thanks to everyone who was involved in organizing this event and to all of you who came out for this event. I personally, between the pandemic and parenting over the past few years, have had very few occasions to be, in a standing room only room with other cultural Marxists. So I'm really, it's an honor to be here with the others. I'm honestly honored by the company of the other panelists and really happy to be here with all of you. So thank you. I want to just start by situating myself a little bit in this room because I'm not trained as an intellectual historian or a political theorist. Rather, as Isi said in her introduction, I teach in a department of media and communication studies, and probably most of my colleagues are empirical social scientists. I'm increasingly in conversation with computer scientists and engineers and so on. So when I was asked to reflect on the Frankfurt School or critical theory in the future, I did so. I'm doing so from that perspective. I like to say, on an airplane or something, I'll just say, I studied the internet. But if I'm talking at slightly greater length, I like to say I study how people live with data-driven technologies, sort of the stories we tell ourselves about technology, how we make meaning with them. And when I say data-driven technology, just to be clear, I don't just mean social media or the so-called public sphere, so-called, because I think platforms optimize to extract as much personal data as possible for the purpose of raising stock values and improving proprietary ad tech algorithms can necessarily perform the functions, emancipatory functions of publicity that Barnaby's favorite Habermas was keen to recuperate. I also mean dating and hookup apps, work scheduling algorithms, credit scoring algorithms, and so on. Increasingly, as we know and as Ajay talked about last night, big data and algorithms mediate almost every aspect of our social lives. And so reflecting on why I personally kind of constantly find myself returning to critical theory despite none of my colleagues and certainly not my dean, many people in my discipline not wanting to hear about it and find it surprisingly useful is this. I think that members of the Frankfurt School in their different ways modeled a way of doing defetishizing critique. And Shayla talked about this last night, the idea of defetishizing critique of media technology and the role of technology in mediating, right? Not producing, but mediating contemporary, or for them, not our contemporaries, social crises. In the years I've been writing critically about digital technologies, which my horror is like almost a decade now, there's been this real swing from techno-optimism to techno-pessimism. To throw out a few signifiers to evoke this arc, it's the shift from Obama is, because Obama and post-2008 Facebook is going to save the American economy, and also the Middle East will become democratic because Twitter. It's sort of the pendulum swing from that to, post-Snowden, Gamergate, Trump, Cambridge Analytica. All these previously nice white people in this diner are now like QAnon worshiping maniacs because Facebook has become a dominant kind of cultural narrative. It's striking to me, I feel like when I very first started teaching in my PhD, this wasn't the case, but now it's just like total common sense among my undergrad students that social media are bad and the algorithm is bad and Mark Zuckerberg's a jerk, whether or not he can beat up Elon Musk in a cage match and so on. But I think, while I'm glad broadly of this shift in the discourse about technology, I think that this kind of techno-pessimism or techno-dystopianism, like the techno-optimism before it, is a fetishizing discourse, right? These are stories that fetishize technology in the sense that they treat it as an object acting on people as objects rather than a set of social relations among things. And I think they're wrong. They're empirically wrong in that they don't offer that good an account of what's going on with those QAnon people in the diner or much anything else. And they're politically wrong in that ultimately, whether we're calling them, the good boy geniuses or the evil geniuses, it leaves all the political agency with the Mark Zuckerbergs, Elon Musks, et cetera, of the world. So I returned to the Frankfurt School because I find they offer a different model of attending closely to the aesthetic and material properties of media technologies, what Adorno called, I think the first time he does it is in the Princeton Radio Research Project, although there are people here who know better than I, but what he calls the psychotechnics of media technologies, and embedding sort of close attention and analysis to that in political economy and libidinal economy. And so in terms of how that's helpful for thinking about sort of defetishizing critique of technology in the present and future, I wanted to just say a few more words about what I see as continuities from this Frankfurt School work, and there's sort of strange discontinuities and continuity from the past to the present or future. And then I wanted to mention just a few conceptual resources, a few of the concepts in Frankfurt School thought that I'd found useful for thinking about data ontologies and generative AI and so on. So continuities, what connects the Frankfurt School to the present and the future of media and technology critique? I think there's a real temptation, I've experienced the temptation towards analogy or continuity, right? Towards looking at, the sort of the Frankfurt School predicted Trump line, which is, there are times where it's tempting to just like read passages from Prophets of Deceit, and it's like, that sounds like Alex Jones. That could be Tucker Carlson back when he had a platform. But I think especially for those of us who maybe feel sometimes precarious or embattled as humanists, it can be tempting to do this, to be like, hey, look, it's our guys, the alt-right, they're talking about our guys, you should listen to us. But I think the right thing to do is to think about it, to think about the legacy of the Frankfurt School in this context more historically or genealogically. And in particular, to think about the profundity, I think, of their analysis of the role of media technologies in mediating fascist subject formation and authoritarianism, while also recognizing that this analysis was in many ways inadequate, has often been misunderstood, and had unanticipated consequences. And I've said this in writing, so I feel embarrassed repeating my own joke, even though I'm sure nobody read the piece. But it's there's something I think we really need to think seriously about, like, to what extent is Cambridge Analytica the realization of techniques developed in the authoritarian personality study, right? You take out the emancipatory dimension, and it's a script for how to make people go fascist. So anyway, members of the Institute had, of course, been writing critically about media and technology before emigrating to the United States. I'm thinking of Adorno and Benjamin's debates about mechanical reproducibility, the essay on, the fetish character in music, and the famous artwork essay. But their reckoning with media technologies, a lot of it took place here in the United States, in California. It's also a California story in a certain way. And in relation to this question of potential fascism in the United States, it was there that Adorno and Horkheimer developed many of their canonical accounts. In the US, I think they articulate this analysis of how mass media mediate the sadomasochistic identification of the atomized individual with the fascist leader, right? And the experience of one's own domination as pleasure. And again, it strikes me that they do so in a way that's very attentive to what, now someone like me would call the affordances of media, or particular properties of media, talking about how the close-up, for instance, at once spectacularizes the leader and brings him near, how the radio brings the voice into the house. So these technical capacities, as well as narrative or rhetorical tropes like the threat-help pattern and so on. In the culture industry essay, despite its flaws, there is this kind of political economic view grounding this power of media in the vertical integration of the culture industry, ironically, right before the studio system was broken up in 1954 by antitrust laws, but that's another story. And I think it's really important, I want to flag, and someone like the communication scholar Fred Turner has written about this, that the authoritarian personality study is in direct dialogue, sort of in this Northern California intellectual milieu, with folks thinking about quantitative social scientific method, who are later very influential on cognitive science, sort of early computer science, and so on. So there are these direct historical connections. The critique of mass media and stereotyping, or at least the way this critique was received in the United States, also has a huge influence, and this is something Fred Turner has written about, on early computer scientists and hobbyists and members of the counterculture who start experimenting with multimedia and interactive media in the 60s and 70s. Marcuse, of course, is also a big influence in the Bay Area. But I think this brings us, this continuity actually brings us to a very troubling question and historical irony, which is, what do we do with the fact that interactive media were supposed to be the non-fascist, sort of democratic alternative to these mass media that hypnotize the masses into passivity and so on, but in fact don't seem to bring about democratic personalities on their own. In fact, if anything, they maybe exacerbate certain authoritarian dynamics. I was going to talk about it, and I think it would take too long, but I've just finished a study with a computer scientist where we've looked at millions of dunk or like hate posts at scale, hate sharing, as I call it, and found that this practice, and I'd be happy to say more about this if anyone's interested, but this practice is actually mesurably associated with higher levels of engagement of user. I mean, of course, any of us knows this, right? But we found a way to show it at scale with higher levels of engagement, stronger modularity or community structure within networks, so like the formation of small communities in a dispersed network, and also greater network centrality than just sharing stuff you like or not hating on things. So there's this very troubling way that it's like, okay, these interactive social media reprise sort of precisely the dynamics of authoritarian socialization that were supposed to come from mass media. And there's this troubling irony that in many ways, the most influential readers, I hate to say it in this room, of the Frankfurt School, you could argue, on digital media are figures like Andrew Breitbart and Peter Thiel, who haven't actually read them, but it doesn't matter, actually, because of their power and influence. And I don't mean to say that this is the fault of theory or critical theory, but I think it points to the inadequacy of simply repeating past analyses and also the need to think in a complex way about how those analyses can be politically useful in the present. Because by the Frankfurt School's own terms, their analysis of mass media doesn't work in the present, right? It has to be more historically specific. So much for connections. I did want to say a few words, as I mentioned, just about conceptual resources that I've found Frankfurt School texts offer for thinking about this predicament, right? This particular moment of reactionary modernisms or new authoritarian formations coming out of digital media. And it's been my experience that I tend to find the thinking that's most useful nearer to the margins than the center of the canon. So it's less the culture industry essay than, Adorno's book on astrology, which I love. Yeah. It's all about interactive media, the jargon of authenticity. And to just throw out, maybe because I feel I'm going a bit long, I'll just say the book Stars Down to Earth about astrology, which I would argue reads astrology columns as interactive media with scripts for doing things, has these concepts of pseudo-personalization and compulsivity, sort of compulsive exercising of agency in relation to media that I think are utterly relevant for thinking about apps and social media today. I think also Adorno's critique of ontology in the jargon of authenticity is extremely useful for thinking both about contemporary data taxonomies and ontologies, right? So the procedures and practices whereby companies like Palantir are deciding how we will be legible to different kinds of state and other institutional systems through our data. And also, especially since generative AI and sort of machine learning algorithms have been such a topic of concern, at least for those of us who, grade undergraduate essays in the past little while. I think Adorno's critique of ontology is actually extremely useful for thinking about technologies that are effectively machines for turning the future into the past, right? And that's what machine learning algorithms do, right? It's pattern recognition systems that produce predictive outputs or statistically probable outputs based on the past. In the past few years, I've had occasion to do a fair bit of political or education and reading groups and things with engineers. And there's a kind of thought experiment that I've stolen from Safiya Noble that I like a lot, where you ask, how would you design a non-racist credit rating or predictive policing algorithm? And of course, the hope is that the engineering students say, let me think about it. What kinds of data could you go to? And the point of the exercise is that you couldn't, right? There's no history. There's no corpus of data that you could use that isn't sort of imbued with the histories of domination and racist oppression. So anyway, to bring this to some kind of conclusion, I wanted to say that when I think about the Frankfurt School in the future, I think the key thing, for me anyway, is to find ways to take seriously the way that their analysis resonates in the present. And again, you can look at Alex Jones or Tucker Carlson when he mattered and say hey, Prophets of Deceit is pretty good for reading these guys actually, without reifying and fetishizing the Frankfurt School itself, their concepts themselves, sort of to keep them open and to think with them rather than apply their concepts as they themselves would not have wanted to do to this very different historical situation. Last night, I wanted to say I finally bought, for a decade, I've wanted an Adorno is Right t-shirt and I never got one. And so I finally bought one from the table over there last night. But I was thinking, when I wear this t-shirt about an entry, thinking of it as an entry to a conversation or a kind of joke, like all good jokes, I think it's actually quite serious. Yes, the stakes are high. There's a huge amount of power being placed in different kinds of data-driven technologies right now. Path dependencies are being created that are very difficult to undo once they're established. Even, again, here's the anti-fetishistic point, even if the tech doesn't work, right? Like any of us who's gotten a shitty ChatGPT authored paper knows, sometimes the harm of the tech isn't predicated on the tech being that good. Another thing I say to undergrads, is the problem with Palantir that their surveillance software is so good, or is it that the police use it, right? And so anyway, I think I'm interested in continuing to think with these more marginal texts and concepts that take seriously the intersection of political and libidinal economy about the data-driven technologies that hold so much power in the present, and maybe hold on a little bit to that humanist, sort of the same tendency that can see Odysseus as the embodiment of the bourgeoisie, where it's not pure historical determinism, but there is a certain interest in the transcendence of the human, to hold on to that as a principle of possible hope. So thank you.
We got started a little bit late, so I'm going to ask our commenters as much as possible to keep your comments to about 10 minutes, and I can signal you around that time if you'd like. Yeah.
So you say this now after everybody already went 20 minutes. I want to begin with the question of this panel was the usefulness of the Frankfurt School for the future, and I'm going to say, yeah, it doesn't really matter. There's not one, and I want to give you a little background. Yeah, the future of the Frankfurt School. No, we don't need life is short. Are you going to spend your time reading this stuff or other stuff? I wouldn't recommend it. So I want to give a background of how I get there. I worked on my dissertation in 91, 92 in Frankfurt in the Habermas Circle. I was super psyched to be able to co-teach a seminar at the Institute for Social Research. It's ultimate fangirl. It was very exciting. I had first learned about the Frankfurt School not until 1985, 86, when I was working in a bookstore across the street from Columbia. I just started graduate school there. I don't remember the name of it. It wasn't like a university. It was a real bookstore back in those days. And there were these great books, the compilations put together by Andrew Rado, those edited versions. It was really exciting. And someone else who worked in the bookstore introduced me to the Frankfurt School. I never heard of, honestly, I knew nothing about, I never knew there was anything like Western Marxism as an undergraduate. I mean, this is, and I was a history major. Bad school, I was at Princeton, but it was just it was the Cold War. I was doing Soviet studies, and Marxism was Marx and Lenin. And so on the one hand, it's just God, you're really stupid. On the other hand, it was also the case that there was this Cold War setting where it was either, the Soviet Union and China over here, the real Marxist communist places, or the United States. And it is still like that. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And I think that setting is why some people got kind of taken by the Frankfurt School, is that it seemed to be some kind of alternative, and that in fact it's not. In fact, it is a perspective that's profoundly right. And so Adorno is right. It means Adorno is right wing, that it depends on denying and denigrating the Soviet achievements, and as well as Marxist-Leninist struggle. So that's my base, that's my background. But let me give you another kind of argument, just in case everyone's not on board. So I am on the, Frankfurt School is not really that useful for us now. I'm going to give an exception. Jay has a really great chapter in this book on the future of the state, and he uses Franz Neumann. And it's a really super useful analysis. So that's good. It's kind of, I really like that. I think it's a really good piece. And he uses Neumann to talk about the social power against the power of capital. So that's really good. It's not a surprise to me that he's not using Horkheimer and Adorno, because I don't think that they're all that useful. Now, let me say, so then I'm going to give you a kind of a mnemonic for thinking about why they're not useful. And we'll call, in a good old Maoist way, we'll call these the 4 replacements. So first,
Are we gonna struggle session?
afterwards. So after everyone fully gets the 4 replacements that are part of the problem with the Frankfurt School and why we actually don't need them. First, they replace materialism with idealism. Absolutely. Horkheimer says, any hope. Why don't you let me talk and not interrupt? How about that? So they replace materialism with idealism, right? This is the whole thing with instrumental reason. And with, there are things like, oh, all hope lies in thought, if there is any of that. They replace capital. This is the continuation, the second replacement. Not just replacing materialism with idealism, but replacing capitalism with instrumental reason. Third, they replace optimism with defeatism. That's what negative dialectics is. And fourth, they replace class struggle with Mandaриnism and intellectualism. So if you want an orientation that disregards the people and the popular, that forfeits practice and struggle for a tarted up philosophy that makes incomprehensibility a virtue, then yeah, go for it, right? Like that's the stuff for you. But if you actually think that, people are not idiots, that culture is not just something injected into people, that people can struggle and make a difference, then it's not the kind of thing that you need to read. Now, let me dial it back just a bit. It's not a retreat, but I'll dial it back just a tad. And here you might consider the 4 replacements, right? The replacement of materialism with idealism, capitalism with instrumental reason, optimism with defeatism, and class struggle with intellectualism. You might also think of those as guideposts for criticism, right? How you can think about things that come across, come across your feed, right? Is something actually an idealist view? Is it actually eliminating class struggle in favor of a kind of elitism or intellectualism? If you think, okay, maybe that's useful, then actually, now I'm going to not dial it back. There's somebody better to read for that kind of exercise, and that would be Albert O. Hirschman and his discussion of conservatism in terms of jeopardy, perversity, and futility. And so what I'm going to do is show how that actually applies to Horkheimer and Adorno. So as you recall from Hirschman's discussion of how conservative arguments work, it's what's called the rhetoric of reaction. He emphasizes these kinds of arguments begin with a jeopardy claim, namely, oh, X or Y is bad, like the position or the practice X or Y is bad because it puts other values into jeopardy, right? So that's a classic conservative move, like you reject X because it's going to it's going to jeopardize things that you hold dear. There's another kind of conservative argument, perversity, and that's the one that says X is wrong because it will achieve the opposite of what you're going for. And then the third one is futility, which says X is wrong because it's pointless and it won't actually result into any good. So jeopardy, jeopardy, perversity, I missed one, and futility. So the last one's futility, X is wrong. I think I skipped perversity. Perversity goes, it'll do the opposite. Futility, everything is always bad. Now, these 3 arguments actually apply to the way that Horkheimer and Adorno reason. So here's a little example from Horkheimer, but Barnaby already mentioned this, toward a manifesto. So Horkheimer says, and this is a classic example of the futility argument. In the long run, things cannot change. The possibility of regression is always there. That means we have to reject both Marxism and ontology. Neither the good nor the bad remains, but the bad is more likely to survive. The critical mind must free itself from a Marxism which says that all will be well if only you become a socialist. We can expect nothing more from mankind than a more or less worn out version of the American system. My politics emphasizes revolutionary optimism. And that's the opposite of this. If you think I'm just taking this out of context, yes, sort of. But here's another example. One more example. One more example. Can y'all I don't know why you think it's okay to just keep interrupting me, both of y'all. Another example here. Horkheimer again. Today we have to declare ourselves defeatists, not in a fatalistic way, but simply because of the situation we find ourselves in. There is nothing we can do. We should not turn this into a theory, but have to declare that basically we cannot bring about change. We must not act as if we still could. And this is not an exception. This is the way that their thought evolves. This is the basic premise of the dialectic of enlightenment, right? We don't become free. Right? Diversion is one where we can't become free. It's an ultimately perverse theory where the more you know, the less you know. I mean, people think of this cultural Marxism that's against the people. That's nuts, right? Cultural Marxism that's against jazz. Come on, we can do better than that. So I think that ultimately what the Frankfurt School offers is an anti-Marxist, anti-communist view that pretends to be Marxist and actually is ultimately deceitful.
Hi. I would like to just take a moment before I start he's going to kill me, but I just want to acknowledge all the labor that Mark DeLucas did in putting this event together. Mark goes above and beyond every day to keep VISTA running and is the reason why we're here in part. Thank you to everybody who organized this event. I'd also just like to take a moment to acknowledge Susan Gillespie, who is sitting in front of me, who's the reason why many people in this room have read Adorno and Benjamin, because she translated them from German to English. I'm gonna yine a bit of what Jodi said. I think the problem with Adorno and Horkheimer is that they had a sense of humor, and there's a lot of sardonic humor in those quotes that were read. But I'm gonna start somewhere else. Most of you who know me or have heard me speak in public about the Frankfurt School, not Hannah Arendt, but the Frankfurt School, know that my personal motto is embrace despair. And I often think about the quote that Barnaby read at the beginning, which is the beginning of the final fragment of Minima Moralia, that all philosophy that can be responsibly practiced in the face of despair has to be done from the standpoint of redemption. And one of the words that I feel has been missing from some of the conversation that I've heard today is emancipation. And I think it's worth remembering that when the Frankfurt School was founded, that it was an emancipatory project at the time in Germany, at that point in time. So I'm going to go back even further, because the topic of this panel, to think about the Frankfurt School into the future, it's actually quite impossible for me. I'm not very good at thinking into the future. I'm not an oracle or an astronomer. But I know. I was born in 1984, the good Orwellian year, I like to say, and I know I'm old, and I know, and no, I'm a working class kid from Michigan. My mom was a waitress. My dad worked at the local Kroger. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, second generation immigrants. My earliest memories are literally of standing on the strike line with my father for the UFCW strikes and protests, picking up food boxes. And when I discovered the work of Marx at the tender age of 14 at my local Barnes and Nobles, it was revolutionary for me. I read the economic and philosophic manuscripts, and I read Capital, and I read the Communist Manifesto, and I felt like I had finally picked up a book that could help me make sense of the material conditions in which I was living, which were conditions of profound alienation that I was always consciously aware of. And when I went to college, I very quickly discovered the work of Erich Fromm my freshman year, because in high school I'd also been obsessed with Freud, found my way to Fromm. I could take or leave Fromm today, but I found Marx's concept of man, and then I found Adorno. And for me, reading critical theory was not just theory. It gave me a way to actually think about the world. It wasn't an orthodox framework, and it wasn't just a form of diagnosis, but it made me feel like I actually had the power to do something. And I did. I became a union president. I went and got involved in labor work. I worked on political campaigns and other sorts of, forms of political action. One of the passages from Toward a New Manifesto that I find myself thinking a lot about these days is a joke, another joke that Horkheimer makes, which is that theory is not roast goose. As much as we should not fetishize the work of critique, we should not fetishize the work of theory either. But I fell in love with the Frankfurt School tradition of critical theory because it had given me this apparatus in thinking through which I felt like I could actually be an active participatory member in the world of politics. So, like Jodi, I was a fangirl. I went to Frankfurt to do my postdoctoral work, not with Habermas because I'm the next generation, but with Axel Honneth. And what I found there was incredibly despairing to me. I did not find the Frankfurt School that I had fallen in love with. I was sitting in a seminar, which was an incredibly privileged place to be, that you had to petition to join an interview. And I was reading liberal democratic theory, the kind of theory that I had left in America. And it was really, I felt so deflated. I felt like everything that I had personally held onto to orient myself toward the world was taken out of my hands. So I started translating Hannah Arendt's poems, forthcoming next year from Live Right. And I stopped going. To the seminar. And, I've been teaching critical theory for this point, at this point for 15 years. And what I love is that there's always a point in the semester, usually when we're halfway through dialectic of enlightenment, where the students come to my office and they say, I feel like I can finally see things. And they're having that moment that I had when I was 18, and I love it. And then at the end of the semester, they always say the same thing to me. I feel like you have led me to the edge of an abyss, and I have no idea where to go. And that's where I find myself standing, at the edge of that abyss. And I don't know what critical theory is today. When critical theory was coined as a term in 1933, it reflected kritische, which came from Kant, and it reflected Theorie, which came from Marx, and the tradition of ideology critique, which was born during the French Revolution. I don't know what those words reflect today. I don't know. I don't know what my relationship to critical theory is today. When I was thinking about this panel, I was sitting at my computer making a list of all the terms of critical theory, starting with the work of Marx, thinking about alienation, reification, commodity fetishism. And I got to the point where I was writing polymorphous perversity and thinking about Marcuse and that moment in 1968, 69, when things break. Things stopped. And I think that's part of the reason why it is easy to fetishize critical theory today, because we have not actually reckoned with what has happened to the tradition of critical theory. There have been several turns in critical theory. There was a turn in 1968, 69. I don't know what we want to call it. Maybe the postmodernization of critical theory. I'm not sure, but it has led to an understanding of hyper-individualism, which is completely complicit with the kind of neoliberal economic model that we find ourselves living in today, where there is no subject anymore. Everyone, even the conversations around technology keep bringing us back to this, but we are consistently being marketed back to ourselves as objects. The extent to which we are isolated in our contemporary society is hardly graspable. Where is a collective politics? Where does critical theory take us to an understanding of collective politics today? Not just a vision for the future, because I don't believe in utopian thinking. I don't know where that takes us either. I don't think we can predict the future. But I do believe in moving towards a way of thinking about critical theory that takes us closer to one another as people who are trying to live under the material conditions of the world in which we find ourselves today. And I think the third term and turn in critical theory, which we should also, is perhaps talk about, it is sitting here, which is what Jodi was describing, that there is a fracture in the tradition of critical theory today, which is moving towards a new tradition of radical critical thinking that has seen the stagnation and the limitation of the traditional critical theory that was born in Frankfurt in the early part of the 20th century as a way to account for failed revolution and the rise of Nazism. The material conditions of our reality today are radically different. And I think that if we're going to talk about critical theory into the future, we have to break with the orthodoxy of what has become traditional critical theory. And I don't know how to do that. I'm not going to give you an answer, but I want to throw it on the table as part of a conversation.
Thanks, Sam. Woo. All right. This is an unenviable position. I mean, I gave a little bit of like my spiel gloss on critical theory last night. And I actually wrote a chapter for one of those like billion-dollar, edited volumes on literally like what does critical theory mean in the 21st century. So if you want to read me on that, like just email me, I'll send you a PDF. I think instead of like doing that, going through intellectual history, I did my spiel about, Angela Davis and like today we have to be both critic and technician. But instead of doing that, I think I want to talk about the ways in which critical theory informs the project I'm now in the process of finishing, because it's almost as opposite as one might imagine a critical theoretical text to be. Namely, I've been working for now 5 years, Christ almighty, on a politics of climate change, which means I'm like knee deep, not in Adorno and Horkheimer, but in like branches of fucking chemistry I didn't even know existed. Deep empirical detail, deep historical detail about how certain kinds of social change have happened in the past. And something I always say to students in my intro class on Frankfurt School is, in fact, this very much jives with what Jodi is saying. I say, if you're here for what I call politics, like the real politics as the confrontation of power, right? You've come to the wrong class. But this is maybe the point of departure. Critical theory does inform every step of how one could generate what we might even call a revolutionary or pragmatic or radical realist politics today. And I'll use climate as an example of this. So the way in which I always approach this, and in fact, this touches on questions that people have raised across this panel, is first that people assume this is a universal, right? So bringing a critical theoretical method to this, no, it is not. It is the idea that it is universal is useful for existing power. So therefore, I must bring a critical theoretical method to the idea that climate is in fact universality and does not in fact affect people across different timescales and across different geographies differently, and therefore subsequently is Pache, Ellen Meiskin Woods, a wonderful line to demarcate a class struggle around, or something like a class struggle, right? So that'd be the first thing. And then the second would be, well, I actually have to not only take up my 19th century Marxism, and this is where I actually, like, I love eco-Marxists, they're great cats, but sometimes, like, there's an obsession with scholasticism, like, oh, Marx got it in, like, 1871, he totally got it. Like, okay, neat. That doesn't really tell me that much about what we're going to do today with a vastly different set of knowledges. And if I could like resurrect the spirit of like, you know, the old Moore, he would be like, fuck my chemistry. I want to know their chemistry. I want to know what's going on. Right. So again, I have to bring a critical methodology to that. And additionally, right, this brings us to tech, as Moira was talking about. It's not so much, right, techno-optimism, techno-pessimism, right? Climate debates are fractured often around that sort of divide, but often it's what do we even mean by the word technology, right? So I'll use a really clean example. There's all kinds of folks who try to sell you, this by the way comes straight out of the oil industry and the concrete industry, the promises of carbon capture and storage. And this is called high tech. Now, if you read a bunch of engineering journals from post-colonial states, as I do, weirdly, you'll see a bunch of different arguments. For example, you'll see like, oh, we can use this kind of building material and water cooling and this, that, and the other. But they're not like saying, let's go back to 14th century Iran or 14th century Mali. They're saying, oh, we can adapt this kind of technology to modern buildings in the following 16 ways. Now, to a lot of even lefty, I have to admit, minds in the West, that sounds low tech or romantic, but it's just as high tech as CCS, and it also actually fucking works, which is important. Adorno would hate me for saying something like, it's better because it works. The fourth thing, which I think really touches on also what Barnaby and Jodi were talking about, is you are forced into a reckoning with a very short time scale and this question of the subject, right? And this is, Jodi, we were talking before, and I talked about how much I love your book, Comrade. It's exactly because of this, right? What's the line? Not everyone, anyone, but not everyone can be a comrade, which is a wonderful way of thinking about the struggles, the multiple struggles that happen around that sort of social ecological nexus without it just becoming an empty liberal pluralism of everything. And that to me is brilliant. And I hate to say it, it's good critical theory. Right? And then finally, right, this brings us back to utopia and all that kind of jazz. I can't predict the future either, you know? But we talked about this, yeah. But, you know, one of the things that critical theory brings to bear on a political project like that is all the paths not taken that could be not just like sustainable in that sort of like gray, ugly word, but so much better, like so much freer, so much more exciting, so much more interesting than frankly, the extraordinarily conservative, we're talking about Hirschman tonight, conservative imaginations that have entranced, again, even many on the left who were just like, if I can't just make bourgeois society for everyone all the time, then I have somehow fucking failed, right? My only value system is GDP. My only aesthetic measure is the box office. My only understanding of culture is what Burger King told me. And there are Marxists today, self-professed Marxists, I think that there's nationalists, but like who believe those things. And they're not doing dialectical or historical or scientific materialism. They are entranced with an ideology. And again, critical theory helps us there. Oh, that means the power's gone. Try this one. I also have a weird background in tech.
Thank you all so much. Three very quick points from me before just to prompt you to sort of respond to one another. One theme that I sort of, or through line kind of across your presentations is this idea of the centrality of storytelling, right? Like, how do we tell stories that galvanize us to, in Walter Benjamin's words, meet the world with cunning and high spirits, right? How do we develop categories that remain provisional and non-essentializing? What's at stake in the analogies we use? How do the borders, how sort of porous are the borders of categories, and how do categories move? So like a small example I think of is Like a J. I'm a big fan of Franz Neumann and the Kirchheimer, and I think a lot about the Nazi reports that they all wrote for the OSS. And there's a very, very small line in Kirchheimer that I think about all the time in the essay, The Abrogation of Nazi Laws, in which there's a sort of instruction that the government should make sure that no substitute symbols for the swastika make their appearance, right? The worry is about sort of ersatz symbols that kind of continue to effectively represent the Nazi movement, even though they're not themselves the original symbols that were used. And this is one of these ways in which I think in many ways the right is more attentive to the way that that meaning can be played with, that categories that we use to narrativize the social world to ourselves can be played with. And that's something that I don't often think emerges out of critical theory conversations, right? This real question of like, how do we tell stories? And what's at stake in the categories that we use to tell them? The second theme is this question of unintended consequences. And Ajay sort of started to touch on this in his discussion of paths not taken. And sort of this jives with Moira's comments as well about kind of all of these ironies and upshots of, certain kinds of political analyses. But how do we make sense of the unintended consequences or unexpected uses of certain kinds of social thought, right? It's a kind of open question for people in this tradition to really think about, what it means that their ideas are taken up in certain contexts and what it means to develop ideas that are capacious enough to respond effectively to that kind of thing. And then the third thing I wanted to say is more to the question of sort of where critical theory is today. And I apologize if this is something that perhaps came up this morning. I wasn't here at the time. But I think one place where the work of ideology, critique, and praxis takes place today is in something like the prison abolition movement, right? Which operates, one, as a form of ideology critique, two, as an analysis of social totality and the ways that material configurations come together with or are sort of mutually constitutive with certain social phenomena, but also the articulation of a program of collective politics and the imagination of sort of different possible futures. And in some ways, the question of sort of what critical theory is today, or sort of what the tradition of critical theory is today, is the wrong question, and the question of kind of where we find the spirit that animated kind of the original critical theoretical project, where we find it is more interesting to me. And so with that said, I think I'd like to open the floor to if any of you have responses to the panel in general.
Thank you. General response, or do you have a? What do you want to?
What do you think? Are there things you want to respond to in each other's?
Fine, go for it, man. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I've written some notes. I have to tell you something, a secret. I was told before this panel that there may be fighting on it. And I was told that we were apparently all very disagreeable types. And I thought, except you, I was told that Moira's not remotely disagreeable. And I thought, oh, that's good, because I'm going to come onto this conference about the Frankfurt School and say that actually I'm not that keen on the Frankfurt School. I think they have this unworkable conception of social totality, and I'm going to feel very aggressive and a bit guilty. And then Jodi made me feel like I was very nice. So, like I'd been so friendly, and I wasn't one of those naked students in front of Adorno anymore. So So I just want to say something, trying to engage, because I think you issued the kind of provocation. And I want to say something to Comrade Dean. So, because I think that there are different ways of thinking about the kind of what we both regard as the kind of ultimate impasse of the Frankfurt School project, and its end in a kind of defeatism and fatalism of the forms that could be a Habermasian accommodationism, or it could be a sort of value form retreat from politics, or it could be a Honathian retreat into normativity alone, or these different forms of loss of hope of some kind of capitulation, at least from the perspective of the question of the finding of political subjects who can actually mount struggles against capital, against states, against imperialism. So I think there are different ways of thinking about the problem. And I think we have to begin by thinking that central problem for those of us who care about winning is to understand why we keep losing. The central thing we have to understand is why we lost the 20th century. And that means that politics begins by asking what kinds of people actually exist. Because even if you think that the only reason that we lost was because enemy power was stronger than us, that there wasn't anything wrong with the ideas that the left ever had, but it's just that the enemy had all the guns. Even if you think that in having all the guns, they didn't just shoot and kill people. The point about neoliberalism is not just that it was a ruling class assault on a working class, but that it remade the class map, obviously, right? That it made a hegemonic bloc by, in Britain, giving people the right to buy their council homes and so making them into conservative voters. So it remade the kinds of subjects that exist. And the way that we do politics is by engaging with the kinds of subjects that we find. And at least the useful starting point of the Frankfurt School is to say, okay, the Russian Revolution hasn't spread westward. We need to start thinking about the conditions of defeat and failure. And at least that has to be a kind of beginning. I take an unlikely source for that, perhaps. Jay teaches class on the Frankfurt School, the Brooklyn Institute. I teach a class on Lenin. Lenin's all about thinking through the question of failure. In 1914, the problem is that European social democracy, which had a confidence that orthodox Marxism meant this thing called the Western proletariat that was your subject, actually it's turned out that proletariat's become overripe in his term, that there have been imperialism's transformed the nature of the class subject, and so you get European Socialist Party supporting World War I. It's a failure, and so you need to rethink how you do socialist politics. In 1918, he writes his letter to American workers, in which he says we're a besieged fortress. He justifies the revolution, I think in a very beautiful analogy, by saying it was right, even though it caused enormous destruction to your GDP, to wage a civil war to destroy slavery, because you had an imperative to destroy slavery in this country. That's what we're trying to do in Russia. He was right, but he says we're a besieged fortress right now. We don't have any hope as a besieged fortress. We need the revolution to spread. And by 1924, as he has a stroke and then dies, he's engaging this tragic predicament that in fact the kind of repressive mechanisms that were necessary in his view to save the workers' state from destruction may have destroyed the workers' state, may have so hollowed out the institutions of workers' democracy that there no longer is that core of socialism in Marx's conception and in Lenin's, which is workers' self-emancipation. So defeat and the need to craft responses to it is absolutely fundamental in the Marxist tradition. And what we can't do is in the name of a certain kind of orthodoxy, this is why Lenin calls Plekhanov and Kautsky both orthodox and Philistines. They stick to the language of the European proletariat's going to lead a revolution in a moment when there's been a transformation. You need to think differently about radical subjects. And it says we need to turn to anti-colonial revolutions, to the peasantry. Unless one thinks about the kinds of subjects that get destroyed by the enemy and the kinds of subjects that might open up afresh and anew, unless one is in touch with the affects, to use, a contemporary fashionable term, but unless one is in touch with the actual experiences of the world that motivate people to do politics, I think if one starts there, you see that the Frankfurt School offers at least some kind of beginning. And I think the irony is actually, in my view, that the Frankfurt School go awry because they're too orthodox, not because they're insufficiently orthodox, because they're working with a conception of social totality, which means that at the point at which there is no longer a clean proletarian subject that they find in the imperialist countries, in the so-called advanced capitalist countries, at the point at which they no longer find that, it's very difficult for them because that's the way they've been thinking about totality. There's this Lukácsian view, everything is capital, and so there's a kind of singular antagonist. And when that singular antagonist fails to live up to the mission, that they come into a kind of crisis. So I actually think in some sense the problem is that they're too orthodox, not insufficiently orthodox. But I think we have to begin, we have to recognize that after that failure that Lenin's facing by 1924 is a long decades and decades of failure. And communist parties loyal to the Soviet project were able to lead heroic struggles in Vietnam and were able to hold out against American imperialism in Cuba and so on. But in the so-called advanced capitalist world, They were not able to build mass parties that were able to successfully challenge capitalist power. And in Italy and in France, they actually ended up by the late 1970s being handmaidens to neoliberalism. So there's a historic crisis involved in freezing, just as in the times of World War I, in freezing past orthodoxies. We're just going to build our strength among the European working class as the German SPD, and then in 1907, when they lose an election because the proletariat quite likes colonialism, there's a crisis, and some of them say, well, let's support colonialism then. The roadmap didn't work, and there was a need for reinvention. And I think the same thing became true by the 1930s, 40s, 50s, certainly 60s, 70s, when new radical subjects emerge, new coalitions of radical subjects emerge. And one has to be able to think critically and shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that people who say, oh God, I feel a bit despairing, oh God, things are crap. That's not where we should end. But we shouldn't think that anyone who admits that they start there is a political traitor to the cause of emancipation. Because I think that's where we have to start in order to find a way out of it. We have to start, I'm not always a fan of the young Marx, but the young Marx very famously, you'll all know, said, we start with the ruthless criticism of all things existing. And he said ruthless in two senses. He says ruthless both in the sense of being unafraid of conflict with the powers that be, and ruthless in the sense of being unafraid of its own conclusions. And I think people on the left too often fail to do both of those things at once. And that involves a kind of rethinking. And the Frankfurt School can be useful in their questions, even if not in their answers. That's a kind of attempted response to Comrade Dean, and thank you for the provocation.
I'll just have to write your answer.
I think you made a great argument for why it's important for people to study Lenin.
I mean, that's the part that I actually really struggle with. I mean, there's just go to storytelling. One of the stories that is told about critical theory today is the story told about cultural Marxism and critical theory by the far right. And those words are used as they've long been used, often as anti-Semitic dog whistles and as rallying cries for far-right neo-Nazis and far-right nationalists, and used in a way that has led to, in some instances, mass death. The New Zealand shooter mentioned cultural Marxism and critical theory over 600 times in his manifesto as a reason for committing mass murder. And I think this is in part because critical theory today has a very serious communication problem because of I've often joked with my students when I'm teaching critical theory that studying critical theory prepares you to do one of two things in life: to become a critical theorist and teach critical theory, or to go into marketing. No, but the language becomes, yeah, it's real. The language becomes, jargon, becomes a barrier to actually engaging with the ideas, which are much more important than the terminology, though the terminology serves a function of disrupting what it is that people take for granted normatively in the society, so that we can begin to reimagine alternate futures. I hate that this is what critical theory has become in our society today, as a story. And I would love to reframe this story and retell this story in a way that feels more emancipatory. At the same time, I am, and Ajay and Jodi know this, Barnaby probably doesn't, but I am deeply, deeply troubled by the fetishization of Lenin and Mao and what is real, not Habermasian, real left-wing fascism, which is just as dangerous as right-wing fascism. And I do not think that thinking critical theory forward is going to come from these political programs that led to mass death, slaughter, cultural destruction, anti-Semitism, racism, and violence. I think if we were being truly radical and working toward an emancipatory project for the future, we would step much further back in order to begin to critically engage with the failures of history on the left and the right in a way that doesn't lead to a kind of mimetic reduplication or reification of those ideas. And what I have heard in part from Barnaby and Jodi, who I'm sure are going to want to respond and yell at me, which is the disagreement that was promised on this panel. And Jay's like, no, don't you give them the microphone first. I know. I don't think that can be the way forward. And I think that right now, those projects, the fetishization of left-wing fascism, the old school time, and right-wing fascism are working together. And what's lost in these conversations are real people. People who cannot pay their bills. People do not have health insurance. People who get really shitty educations because every public institution in this country has been privatized. And where is a critical theory that deals with people, just working class people, that, there are no, this isn't Marxism that they're talking about. I don't hear Marx in there. I hear forms of ideological orthodox Marxism that led to mass death. And in no way whatsoever do I endorse it politically.
Okay. I am gonna, it's weird for me to end up as the moderate on a panel. Because I don't that. No, I'm not the mediator. Izzy's job. A job I gracefully bowed out of. I think the place I want to come at this, that phrase left fascism, that comes from Habermas. Okay. Okay.
I'm talking about real old school left.
Okay, hold on. Let's just chill out for 1 second. So it's, to me, okay, let's just round that off for a second. Barnaby wrote a really interesting essay. I mentioned one of Jodi's books. I'll mention one of Barnaby's essays, where he talks about Lenin having a kind of Benjaminian moment, particularly in one of Lenin's great political insights, turns when he looks to Asia. It's after the Boxer Rebellion, right? Or something like that, right? And he's like, oh, anti-colonial revolutions in Asia are far more politically advanced than the current social democratic struggles in Europe. Now, this was an incredibly unorthodox view. And that word orthodoxy is really interesting to me, because actually I reject the Perry Anderson mapping of Western versus Marxism. My original research, I try to always wear an Indian thing when I'm talking Frankfurt School, because my original research was about comparing different forms of Marxism around the world in the mid-20th century, one of which was Frankfurt School, but most of which were anti-colonial Marxisms in the global South. And one of the things that really fascinated me about those questions, I only stand by 40% of my dissertation at this point, it was 20 years ago. But one of the things that fascinated me about those questions is pretty much everyone around World War I, forget fucking World War II, right? Think to the early stuff. We're talking late 20s, early 30s, like Benjamin, One Way Street, 1926, things like that, right? Almost everyone, and this includes the Bolsheviks, in particular Lenin, are something went horribly wrong with the International, right? With the Social International. And the Southern authors, interestingly, are even more. They're like, oh, whoa, you see the same arguments. Do we really want European progress? It looks kind of shitty. Clearly, this theory is incomplete, both empirically and methodologically and theoretically. It needs more. So ironically, the thing that gets called orthodoxy, I don't think actually it's Bolshevism too often. Usually what gets called orthodoxy is sort of Western European Kautskyite stuff. And if you read Karl Kautsky in 1929, 1930, you've already got fucking fascists on the streets. And he's like just these pains to like, oh my God, the advances we're making, we're just taking steady strides into the glorious technological future. I want some of what he's on, man. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Everyone, I think, from the Bolsheviks to the Frankfurt School, to the anti-colonials around the world that I used to study, all sort of jibed with that something was wrong. So Frankfurt School guys really focused on superstructure, right? And I think, Jodi, this is what you're calling idealism. I would disagree, but whatever. They really focus on cultural questions, right? The Bolsheviks ended up becoming very driven by almost like a geopolitical theory, right? And many of the anti-colonials, Fanon being one of the most obvious, but I'm also thinking people like Ali Ahmed, all kinds of folks around the world, really are challenging this question of the unit of the subject. Like, we need something broader than the traditional understanding of the proletariat as generated at the point of production and that specific form of exploitation. And to me, this critical theory is one of many directions that generate out, except ironically, orthodoxy. Right? Orthodoxy in the Kautskyite sense, to me, is the deadest of dead traditions. It is the ultimate failure. And that is really the political puzzle right now to me. Oh, sorry, did everyone, Moira?
No, but I actually, Great. So we'll take questions in pairs, I suppose. If you have them, could you please line up near over here toward the front?
Oh, yes. Here you go. Thank you so much.
This one?
Huh? Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Question.
Right over here, so you can see the camera.
Hi. Oh, wow. I wanted to thank Ajay for bringing up climate change and climate issue and the kind of subject that we are going to have to be to respond to it. Climate change is actually, not the right word, right? It's not climate crisis, doesn't do it either, neither does sustainability. We are in a climate emergency, right? You saw those pictures from Vermont, right? We're going to see this in New York City before much longer, right? And we're going to see, an undoing of social understandings all across the world. We are going to see a breakdown of proportions that I think few of us have really contemplated. And we're going to have to do something in response. And we have to do it quickly. And we have to think about where is the subject that will respond to this? It's not the Democrats or the Republicans for sure, right? They're too busy maintaining their grip on power, right? Such as it is. They don't have the power to respond to this adequately. Technologically, we don't have the power to respond adequately. We need to respond socially, right? And we need to do it in a way which goes beyond our national borders, but doesn't ignore the people who live near us, who are going to be in worse trouble now than they are already when they can't pay their energy bills, et cetera, and, don't understand, what to, and I realize this is a speech, not a question, but maybe the question is, what can we learn from critical theory and from our past experience and our organizing work that could help us get through the next decade?
Okay, thank you, everybody. I guess my question was maybe to everybody on the panel, but mostly to Barnaby. It's about, I can't see it. It's about Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism. right? Because he's writing like 3 years after Zimbabwe. And you can tell that throughout the work, he's trying to locate this totality in the Black radical tradition. And of course, a lot of the criticisms about it now is that it's transhistorical. It flattens contradictions throughout different countries. It's essentialist, etc. So I'm like wondering, like, going back to this idea of storytelling and seeing this person who did attempt to tell a story, to root something, root historical materialism and the social reproduction of race in this larger story. And we see how he's responded to now. So kind of like, yeah, I'm just putting that out there. Like, how are you thinking about objects or subjects? Like, what are you rooting this this idea, this object of storytelling in? Thank you.
Hello. Okay, I will quickly say something about Black Marxism, which is a very interesting book that people should read. It seems to me that it involves it relies on a kind of something that is too close to being an essentialist contrast between a European and a non-European tradition, which then invites, I think in some cases, quite egregious misreadings of people like C.L.R. James in order to position their radicalism as something which is exogenous to, which comes from outside their Marxism and is an appeal to a different kind of set of origins. Funnily enough, if you're interested in knowing more about that argument, there was a review essay written a few years after its publication pointing out that the book hadn't really landed very well. It was recently republished, and I think it's interesting to think about the conditions for its recent republication. I'll say something about that quickly in a second. But there was a review essay written a few years after its publication, making this point that the texts celebrated in Marxists, above all in James, it's perhaps more reliable as a reading of people like Richard Wright, but it celebrated as their radicalism things which were too far from, in fact, things they'd taken from their Marxism. And that review essay was by someone quite nice who's now running for president. I find this amazing. In America, there's someone nice running for president, which is Cornel West. And he wrote this very good, very critical review essay of Black Marxism. I think of Black Marxism strangely because it's now revived partly in anti-racist circles in order to say, look, it's possible to be a Marxist. But I think of it, it's written in London, 1983, as part of the genesis story of what became Afro-pessimism, actually. And a very dear friend of mine, Annie Ololoku-Tariba, was writing a very good PhD making this argument, that actually the kinds of arguments that Robinson makes, which flatten a sense of what Europe is, and which treat a kind of trans-historical blackness as a point of antagonism, are remarkably different from the kinds of arguments that one finds in people like James, and for that matter in, for example, in America, the Black Panther tradition. If you read like Huey Newton's famous essay on intercommunalism, you find a very materially grounded, in Britain we have people like Shivananda and Dakas Howe, making these very materialist arguments about the kinds of possibilities of emancipatory subjectivity lying in the colonized and the racialized because of their experiences of racialized proletarianization and so on, not because of a previous trans-historical standpoint. So I think quite critically about the Robinson text, but I also think there's lots that's interesting about it. I do also think that you shouldn't share platforms with people you think are fascists. This, I think, I love holding people responsible for things that happened long after their deaths. I really do. I'm the person who thinks that Jesus Christ laid the railway tracks to Auschwitz. So, yeah. I think every Christmas tree is an anti-Semitic hate crime. So I'm really keen on holding people responsible for wildly inappropriate things. But I think that it's easy to take the liberal or the anarchist position in relation to the Russian Revolution, which is to say it went, or the Stalinist position. It's easy to say either it went wrong because it was always going to go wrong because these people were awful and evil, or it never went wrong, nothing went wrong. But the really challenging position is to narrate the question, how did an attempt at emancipation go so horribly wrong? That's the difficult thing. And labels like fascism just don't get us there. Because the truth is, you take, for example, James Scott has this book, Seeing Like a State, in which he has a chapter on Lenin where he reads Lenin's immediate tasks of the Soviet government, 1918 text. And he takes all these passages where Lenin says we must have brutal dictatorship. But he doesn't tell us that the next sentence, Lenin says the dictatorship can only be exercised if it's maximally democratic. So if it's about really disciplined power that is totally accountable all the time to the oppressed and exploited. And the problem is the failure of that accountability to work in practice. That's the tragedy of the Russian Revolution. And I think we have to engage that tragedy in order to think how to do emancipatory politics today. What we can't do is dismiss it as a failed, stupid project from the start, because it was the most ambitious kind of project in total social transformation and in an idea of actually emancipation, not just as in the increasingly economistic Second International frame, which now returns in a lot of revived social democracy in America and in Western Europe today, an economistic promise of changing the mode of distribution, a bit more value for workers in the imperial core. It was instead a project that attempted to ultimately overcome wage labor itself. And the question of the profound difficulties in the 20th century of that project, I think the Frankfurt School, by asking about the power of culture, the role of media, offer us some resources, I think limited resources. I think Gramsci offers us some resources. I think the Althusserian tradition in France offers us some resources, lots of different traditions for trying to think the failure of that project. But if you start by thinking that the project was rotten from the beginning, I envy you in a way. I envy you because it's easier. Because then it's just, well, they were all evil, so we've got no difficult problems to solve. The challenge of the 20th century was that people trying to do very good things ended up building societies that I think went very badly wrong. And that's the challenge we have to address. And we have to do it by cleaving to the hope of emancipation, not by dismissing people whose noblest followers ended up in Nazi concentration camps as fascists.
Especially the one that you are sitting here defending, which I cannot support because there is a logical fallacy also in the question that you want to prioritize.
I don't.
I'm going to say just two quick answers to the question, and then in this, I mean, I don't want to end up, I feel like the way in which this debate ends always is like some version of the big black book of communism.
Right.
And actually this year, I believe someone's finally publishing the big black book of capitalism, which by the death count, way higher. Especially if you count things like climate and slavery. That is extremely funny, actually. So the thing is about, I'll work my way backwards. I know the Robinson question was largely thrown to Barnaby. I actually think Robinson's really productive in two ways, at least. One is that really interesting argument, and I think this might speak to a different set of interests on this panel, both to tech and to sort of questions of capitalism and stage and politics. The argument about the persistence of feudalism as a social form into capitalism as an ever-threatening response as a return, which I know you care a lot about, and I know you care a lot about. So Robinson really puts that on the table in the form of interrogating race. And then I think part of the popularity, frankly, of why Robinson gets taken up later is not just purely that his like theory is so good and blah, blah, blah. It's that it provokes, and this again, I think is really interesting, what theory causes, what it provokes, what it sort of, you know, jabs you in the side and makes you do. It causes, you know, sometimes Izzy was joking before, like calling the California school of Marxism, people like Ruth Gilmore and others, to start having incredibly deep engagements with questions ranging from like state theory to prisons and all kinds of emancipatory subjects, all kinds of different ways of thinking about the world that are neither Robinson nor many of the folks who came before him. And then on the climate question, I pretty much already said it. The only thing that I will say is, since we're throwing out crazy provocations, is that when I get to my politics section of the politics book, which it takes a lot to get there, I do not, again, turn to my pal Teddy or even Walter. I do want to tell a good story. And I think I do, but the guy who tells the story closest for me from the 20th century is Frantz Fanon, who was he both is framed often as this kind of like prophet of violence, which Arendt that was his argument, that he's not. The end of Wretched of the Earth is this blistering, this blistering sort of, this is what violence in fact does both to me, to my side of the war, and to the other side. But nor is he this kind of, he's been so denuded in the academy that I've seen people be like, oh, it's not about politics at all. It's about recognition and like mutual understanding. No, he really tries to lay home that there's a political divide that is not scrutable from a lot of these earlier vantage points. This is what I think we have to take up with climate. That is not addressable, and here I'll quote directly, by a gentleman's agreement, i.e. Habermasian discourse. It is not, or value plural, like perfect pluralism or something like that. It is not addressable by the wave of a magic wand, i.e. tech will come out of the sky and save us. Oh God, what was the third one? He has a third one, but basically it's an outline of a radical political realism that I think is what we need. And that's where actually, ironically, critical theory pushes me to be like, I cannot adhere to Adorno's arguments on quote unquote ticket thinking. I cannot adhere certainly to Horkheimer's like outrageous conservatism. And finally, the last thing I want to throw back also on this question of orthodoxy is that, I think Barnaby, you mentioned this, Adorno in particular ended up getting stuck because of being so doctrinaire. If you read his private correspondence or even the book, that weird thing that Verso put up towards a new manifesto, which is a failed book project because they didn't agree. Like one of the lines Adorno says is, we must be true to the spirit. Wait, that's a direct quote. We must be true to the spirit of Marx and Lenin. And when Marcuse says, why'd you call the cops on your students? He says, where's the working class? If it's just petit bourgeois students, well, we know what petit bourgeois upset people become. They often become fascists, right? So there's a kind of unwillingness in Adorno to break with orthodoxy that becomes a huge problem.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. Particularly thinking about the political situation where we face on under conditions of climate catastrophe. And what are the effects of a political orientation that are anti-revolution under these circumstances? I think it's terrible. Right? I think that the kind of equation of left and right in an anti-revolutionism is exactly the recipe for stuckness and then burning and drowning and overheating, and that learning from the revolutionary traditions is absolutely necessary right now. The multiplicity of paths that global Marxism took are really interesting. I've been reading Walter Rodney, like so important. Zavaleta Mercado from Bolivia, Mariátegui from Peru, and these are other forms of Marxism-Leninism that get eclipsed and that are absolutely crucial. Cedric Robinson, I'm not really a fan, but I think just recognizing the multiplicity of Marxisms is really crucial. And I want to now do a little plug. I co-edited a book with Charisse Burden-Stelly called Organize, Fight, Win, the Black Communist Women, political writings of Black Communist women. And it's focused on Black women in the Communist Party in the United States from 1928 to 1956. Organize, Fight, Win. It gives you such a different version of what the Communist Party in the US was like than kind of, highfalutin debates, right? It gives you a sense of, like, the party looks different when it's Black women organizing in Harlem, when they're organizing tenants' work, when they're, sharing recipes and deciding, here's the markets where you can go, where they won't treat you badly, right? When they recognize the importance of schools and independent work, right? When they're recognizing sharecroppers. So the struggle looks really different. And these are founding members of the Communist Party in the US. So this kind of stereotype that's just anchored in the Cold War is really damaging for us today.
No, I'm thinking. It is true that I'm the most conflict averse on this panel. But I'm thinking about a few things that don't directly sequit or follow from exactly what we've just been talking about. I mean, I think I was thinking too, because I lived in China, I studied Mandarin, I use it in my research now. And I had the funny experience last semester where I teach this class on media and social movements. And I taught the Cultural Revolution and sort of the Black Panthers' reception of the Cultural Revolution as some little unit. And I caught some of my Chinese undergrads, of whom there are many who are from China, like taking pictures of me to put on WeChat to make, because I thought it was so hilarious that I was putting this up like on a slide, these Cultural Revolution slides. So anyway, I was getting distracted thinking about that while listening to the comments. I think one thing that I was thinking about when Barnaby was talking a little while ago that maybe relates to some of what the controversy that we've just been rehearsing has to do with failure and the politicizing potential of failure. And I find my mind wandering to something very empirical, sort of concrete that I was involved with. So in I don't know if anyone's read Logic Magazine, this magazine. I helped co-found or followed some of the tech worker movement stuff over the past few years. And I think it's in a very different place than it was in 2017, 2018, when I started writing about it. It was very striking to me. And actually, I'm going to interrupt. Well, no, I'll finish this thought and then interrupt myself. It was very striking to me how many of the people I interviewed who came to be involved in this movement to try to stop things like, Google's contracts to build vision recognition systems for the US military, or their, what was it called? Project Dragonfly, their secret plan for a censored search engine in China and so on. It was very striking to me just talking to people in these movements, how many of them were motivated by sort of failure and disillusionment. And it was so this was something I was thinking about while listening to everyone talk about their own journeys with the Frankfurt School as well, and like loving it when you're young and then getting disillusioned with it or breaking with it later. Because I just noted when following this movement how many of the people involved were like in their late 20s to early 30s. And I remember thinking, I was like, it's kind of interesting that it's all these folks who, and I was living in the Bay Area at the time, who got into technology because they sincerely believed as, 20-year-old Stanford or Berkeley CS undergrads that this was the way to make positive change in the world. And then by the time they're 27, have, seen the startup fail and seen enough homelessness on the streets of San Francisco and so on to realize that that was nonsense. And it's very easy it felt easy for me as an adrift PhD student avoiding my dissertation, to come in and say like, you were idiots for ever thinking that that was the right way to make change in the world. But there was something very striking to me about how politicizing, the failure of their techno-optimism was, and also like how much that motivated them to, in some cases, do like fairly courageous things, like, stage walkouts or environmental protests at Amazon that got them fired or whatever. I've seen this more recently in some empirical work on Amazon, which I won't get into, but so just listening, I guess listening to some of the argument and then also to the personal narratives that I think all of us except Barnaby had a little bit of in the beginning of our talks. I guess I was thinking about this question of like youth and the power of a certain kind of cultural Marxism and then seeing its limits, and whether that means needing to get rid of it, or whether there's something politicizing about returning to those failures, or about like the disappointment of failures. And those are lower stake ones maybe than the failures of like major 20th century revolutionary projects, but ones that I've found to be personally very motivating to individual subjects I spent a lot of time talking to about their involvement in political movements. So I was just thinking with that theme of failure, and also what it is in our late 20s, and we're like, oh shit, we were wrong about all that stuff that might be worth coming back to. It's striking to me too, I must say, just coming from an academic field where these thinkers don't have prestige at all. Like nobody in computer science. I mean, again, I say it with all due respect, but I realize that I may have a somewhat different perspective coming from a discipline where there's like nothing at stake in the orthodoxy of these ideas, that maybe in a funny way that makes it easier for me to like go into the cupboard and find what's in this one book that's useful about for thinking about data ontology or whatever. Oh my gosh, I can't see any of them because of the column. Thank you for telling me. I'll stop it there. Please collect questions.
We are already over time, so I'm going to be really ruthless about this. Please limit yourself to one question to the extent that you can. And then we'll take all of the questions together, and then you all can respond.
Hi, this has been a really great event. Thank you. I'm going to put Moira on the spot a little bit because I was listening to the Ordinary Unhappiness podcast. And one of the amazing things that I wrote down was that you were talking about geniuses, and you said that the opposite of hype isn't critique, it's specificity. And I forget who you quoted, but I think it was a quote from somewhere. Anyway, and so I wonder if that quote itself can apply to some of the things here, especially to some of the stuff that Jodi was saying. And I want to suggest that maybe the binarisms that we're making in our critiques of the Frankfurt School as choosing idealism versus materialism, or, practice versus theory, is in itself a conservative move, and practicing the very conservatism that you're accusing them of, right, in instituting these binaries, which I personally don't even thinking of Marx, I think it's impossible to think of materialism versus idealism. And then my genuine question is, I don't know what we mean by emancipation and freedom.
That's the good one.
Yeah, thank you. Love you guys.
Thank you guys. It's been great. Real quick, how does critical theory address the spiritual component of the human? You guys are talking a lot about Marx and all these people who are, great theorists, but there's the rich, emotional and psychological and kind of intangible qualities of people that the spiritual side sort of addresses. Anyway, that's all, the spiritual.
Great. I think I feel like you got more debate and conflict than I imagined, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's good to have these debates
set up
out and open, and as the final panel. And I think that as I was hearing everyone talk, I just kept thinking of this phrase of don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think it's really hard to figure out how to do that. Everyone says it, but it's actually really hard to figure out which part is the bathwater and which part is the baby. And I guess that, I think it's true when I hear people invoke the Frankfurt School, it's undeniable, as I think some of the comments on the panel were saying, that a lot of it does sound like Mandarin elitism, and actually a lot of Marxists do, as AJ was saying, just endlessly quote the sacred texts, and there isn't that much engagement with the present, and yeah. And so I think that there's something really difficult about that. And I think part of what I wanted to ask was about something we didn't talk about that much, which I associate with the Frankfurt School kind of turning it into a methodology, which is the idea of immanent critique. And I think sometimes, in response to the failures of the 20th century, we want to turn to immanent critique. And that's good in some ways. We need to think about the failures of the revolutionary tradition and take that really seriously if we're going to separate the baby from the bathwater. But on the other hand, I do feel often, because I've been trying to work on, a positive vision for the 21st century, and I find that sometimes the idea of immanent critique is actually a block, because what we need is to read contemporary chemistry, not the chemistry Marx was reading, or I spend a lot of time reading contemporary motivation theories, and then every Marxist I meet is well, it's all about whether work can become play. I mean, this is ridiculous, actually read some stuff about this. Don't just quote what some guy said 200 years ago. There's more to it, So I feel like what you guys are talking about are both the deepest questions and some of the real frustrations that emerge at a very personal level, with a tradition that, like all traditions really, seems to sometimes become revolving around the sacred text. And like, if we can only critique the critique, then we can find the critique that matters. And I guess I'm caught between, on the one hand, thinking we should take that really seriously because we do need to separate the baby from the bathwater and figure out which was which. But on the other hand, real skepticism that the answers are to be found, in that way. Exactly. So I guess it's just about imminent critique and whether there's something there worth saving or not.
So we're just gonna go down the line, in part so Ajay can end, because Ajay has some final words for you. Beginning with Barnaby, we can go down the line. You can tell me what the baby is and what the bathwater is.
It is a funny example because immanent critique as a piece of inheritance from a distant past, when in fact the claim of immanent critique is precisely about being grounded in the present. Because the claim of immanent critique is, again, of course, it's all just cribbing. You think that this stuff is we're just cribbing from this guy Marx in the 19th century, but I'm here to tell you it's all just cribbed from Jewish theology. So, the idea that there is something which is at once, this is what God is, that there is something which is at once immanent to the present, utterly within the world, and also transcendent. That's how Marx thinks of communism in a capitalist society. And so that means that in order to think about politics, you have to start by thinking about the present. And there's this kind of strange irony that we're taking a lesson from the past, a particular method from the past, which is all about thinking about the present. I think the challenge is that the violence of neoliberalism lies in part in the devastation of those emancipatory subjects, whether it's, and their institutions, whether it's particular forms of work, the labor movement, socialist parties, national liberation movements, the destruction of all of these things which functioned as transmission belts for ideas so that traditions could be updated, refreshed, kept alive. And in the face of that devastation, I think we face a binary of two kinds of choices on the left, both of which concern me. One is to say, oh God, the tradition died, let's dive back into the moment before it died and just speak those texts. So, I want to read Lenin to understand the challenges, the clever way he was facing his challenges in his moment, but not to think that our world is the same as, Britain, France, Germany, and the USA are the four imperialist powers that work by finance capital. No, the world is different. But it's because traditions die that one response is, okay, we're going to go back to before it died and just try to recuperate that. And the other response is the tradition's dead, shit, it failed, let's try to reinvent the wheel. Let's say that everything in the past was bigoted anyway, and so on and so on. And the problem of both of those responses is that they cut us off from the ability to do that thing which live politics always does, which is participate in traditions, which give us a dialogue with the dead, give us lessons from smart and thoughtful and committed and often seriously effective in some ways people in the past, militants whom we respect and admire as our ancestors, the ability to learn from them without just repeating them as if our world is the same as theirs. That's the challenge, and that is, of course, the baby bathwater challenge. And I think the idea of immanent critique is not only useful as a kind of claim about the transcendent future being contained within the contradictions of the present, it's also useful when tied, as the Frankfurt School does, to a norm. And the norm is the one that was mentioned, which is freedom. And it's very important to say in this country, where there are all kinds of strange and desiccated ideas of freedom, that there's a radical inheritance in which freedom is understood to be basically inimical to hierarchy, in which you cannot be free if you are subservient to others. And that's obviously the tradition of Rousseau, it's obviously the tradition of Marx. And I think it's the tradition of anti-colonial struggle, of feminist struggle, of black radicalism, and all kinds of bold and revolutionary traditions at their best. And so the challenge is how to reawaken the norm of a kind of freedom which understands freedom as being, some of you know Barnaby talks about equilibrity, which understands freedom as being the opposite of hierarchy. How to reawaken that kind of freedom, which is not therefore just about socialism as a politics of the economy which wants better wages, but is about freeing us, and connects that to the challenges of the present, seeing, as the Frankfurt School saw, some of the challenges in doing so by being serious about the kinds of enemy powers we face, both in terms of the people who have all the guns and also the people who get to shape the way we experience the world, the way we experience one another, and the way we think and feel and act.
Ooh. I think I keep being distracted because the baby bathwater thing is like a little literal to me right now. So we'll throw out the water soon, I hope. My bad. I wanted to say something about immanent critique that connected to the question or comment about hype and specificity, where I can't see the person who asked that question now. I'm also like, I haven't listened to the podcast left yet. Did they leave in the stuff about my mom? Because I hope they took that stuff out. Anyway, I think Did they leave in the stuff about? Okay. My mom doesn't listen to podcasts about Marxism. It's okay, I hope. Yeah, I mean, when I said that thing about, so at Logic, we had this line that the opposite of hype is not critique, it's specificity, and that there's this actually very insidious function performed by certain kinds of what this scholarly Vincel calls crita-hype, or sort of like, we're like, oh, the AI is gonna kill us all. Like that only redounds for the benefit of the people who own the AI. And I think when we said that about specificity, and it was actually, I'm so embarrassed, I'm forgetting his last name, but Robin, this guy who wrote Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, who hosted an event with us, who originally said this thing about hype and specificity that became like a Logic line. That we thought, I mean, we didn't call it imminent critique because that wasn't where we were coming from, but I'd say that's very much how we thought about what we were trying to do with technology and thinking about the project. It's like reading the motivation theory. It's like actually talking to the engineers who made stuff. And so I guess I just wanted to say that that comment about hype and specificity, I think, was part of our way about thinking what an imminent critique of technologies and digital technologies might look like in the present. Yeah, and I think I'm actually gonna leave it at that. I'm still thinking about the baby in the bathwater. I'm sorry.
On the binarism, I mean, it's like, you don't like it, I do. It's like binaries are tools for thinking. And so I think you can't even say I'm against binaries without already falling into those. I also think I actually think it's really damaging to keep saying this critique, oh, no, binaries are bad. Like I hate isms or something like that, because we have to know what side we're on. We have to know what we support. We have to know what we're willing to risk our lives for. And those things matter. It's not all one great big mushy soup. We can't go into the marsh. I think on the spiritual, that's a really important question. I don't have anything that I can say about that, and I hope other people do, but because I do think it's meaningful. I got to go on babies and bathwaters and imminent critique. I mean, to my mind, imminent critique is just Hegel, and it doesn't need to. We don't need to give the Frankfurt School the credit for that. And so, sure, let's keep it like it's Hegel and Marx. Like that's super useful. But I think beyond, or I also think part of how I understood what you were expressing was also the complications of practical politics and organizing, and the push around theory and thinking, and then practical politics and organizing and understanding the present reality we're in, and how does that affect how we think about real political struggles right now. And it makes me think these kinds of, the kind of intellectual conversations we're in often seem like they would make a lot more sense if the people in the room, if we were all in a party, like if this was a party meeting, or if we were all even members of the same international. It's like we get, the part of the frustration is, in fact, we're not. And so the organizing questions seem really disparate. But I don't think there's anything we can do about that. I mean, maybe, it is still at some level forming common ways of thinking, even if they're just tiny little tendrils of that. Oh, and emancipation, collective self-conscious determination of a shared future.
So kind of two things, and I'll try and touch on the question of the emotional and spiritual being in the second part of my response. So when Gruneberg became the first director of the Institute for Social Research, in his initial speech to the members of the Institute, he ended by declaring a kind of dictatorship. That was the language he used. He called it a dictatorship of leadership, that the members of the Institute were supposed to follow a kind of Marxist orthodoxy. And I don't know if the history of the Institute was talked about here very much. I wasn't here last night. A little bit, yeah. And so, yeah. And when Max Horkheimer took over the directorship of the Institute in 1935, it was a breath of fresh air for the members of the Institute who had felt intellectually strangled by the demands of orthodox Marxism. With the original founding of the Institute, they were interested in, as Ajay said earlier, in labor, but also in understanding Barnaby's questions. That was the first iteration of the Institute, but it's not what we call the tradition of the Frankfurt School, which really begins with Max Horkheimer, who in his opening speech, we can debate it, in his opening speech, when he took over the directorship, declared that there would no longer be a dictatorship and that people were free to think in a multitude of ways about the various social, political, and economic questions at the time. And he talks about the need to break with ideology. For most of the history of the Frankfurt School tradition of critical theory, ideology has been understood as a bad word. Ideology in two ways. Ideology becomes that which we take on in our thinking that we're unaware of. So like Arendt talks about this in terms of racism really nicely in Origins, actually, in the Origins of Totalitarianism. She says that racism becomes such a pervasive opinion in Western society that people adopt racist ideas without being consciously aware that they are doing so. That's a kind of general understanding of ideology is a bad thing. The other part of ideology, in the sense that Grüneberg was a proponent of it in terms of interrogating forms of orthodox Marxism, is that it is a determinate frame. And anytime you are working within a form of determinate frame, you are in a realm of instrumental reason. And you are engaging in a kind of act of predicting the future, which you cannot do. The real risk of critical theory, thinking toward the future, which we cannot see, should be to let go of the orthodoxies of the past and to think about where we are now. And I think Susan's question about the realities of environmental catastrophe would be a kind of subject position that's really powerful for reimagining how the future might be other than the way things are right now. But as long as you remain committed to either a backward-looking or forward-looking determinate historical frame, you are not engaged in an emancipatory project. When I'm writing a book on loneliness, I've been writing a book on loneliness for like 7 years. And I started it before the pandemic. And the reason that I decided to write the book on loneliness, I was hedging. I taught the class for the Brooklyn Institute because I was interested in it, primarily because Arendt argues that loneliness is the underlying existential condition of all totalitarian movements. I'll quibble with her there, but we're not going to go into it. And I was summoned to a meeting with the director of the Loneliness Project at Harvard University. Wait. I saw that you're teaching a class on loneliness. And he asked me if I was going to write a book, and I said, I don't know, I'm thinking about it. And he said, I'm writing a book. And I said, that's great. And he said, well, tell me why you're interested in loneliness. And I gave this like spiel about alienation and self-abandonment and the ways in which people are isolated in contemporary society and the way in which we're alienated from work and like what's lost spiritually in terms of human connection and creative power and our ability to actually exercise a form of self-autonomy while still being aware of the reality in which we live. And he looks at me and he says, no. And he says, I was talking to the president of Harvard, and I told him that I had a great idea. And this is how I got funding for the Loneliness Project. I realized through my empirical research that people who are lonely contribute less to the GDP, which means that the lonelier you are, the less productive you are. And I kept a pretty good straight face. And I thought, okay, I'm writing a book. Because this is not how we talk about people. This is not how we talk about people. And this question, the Western tradition of political philosophy, especially the Western tradition of political philosophy that the Frankfurt School tradition emerges out of, which is primarily Hegelian and Kantian, I would argue, is very good at taking people out of their bodies and putting them in the realm of their minds and their intellects, which is where we try to know the world and make the world into a knowable object. And if we're thinking toward a future critical theory, I would love to see more work on bodies, on feelings, on affects, on human connection, on the ways in which we relate to our environments. I would love to see more work oriented towards climate, environmentalism, our subject relationship to nature, the ways in which technology have come to so ravenously mediate every facet of human experience today, which is devastating. And I'll end on this note to tie the 2 points together in part. The Pew Research Center has a really interesting statistic, which I think presents one of the fundamental paradoxes of loneliness if we're thinking about it politically, which is that the more a person engages online in social media, the more likely they are to feel depressed, anxious, and withdrawn. Suicide rates, depression rates, you probably know this better than I do, Moira. Teen girls has skyrocketed. I mean, and boys. No, well, the two are connected to each other, absolutely. And the incentives to continue to engage, absolutely. And yet, the more engaged you are in these spaces, the more likely you are, 3 times more likely, to take part in an in-person, real-world political action. And so I would also love to think more about the ways in which, and the ways and we're not engaging technology and these platforms today to actually organize movements or just political projects that could actually help people. Like, why don't we take advantage of social media platforms to collectively start to reduce student debt or to collectively fund healthcare? I mean, the assumption that somehow institutions are still going to save us at this point when we have the power literally in our pocket to collectively organize. Yeah, no, I know. I'm just throwing it out there. Yes. Esther Taylor, others, yes, absolutely. That I wish there was more of this. That's my point.
No, thank you. That's amazing. I mean, I think I can do this pretty fast and then segue us into the cocktail hour. It's really interesting to me that we've sort of come to the affective plane, which Barnaby flagged as almost like a jargon, almost like a contemporary theory jargon term. But like, actually the discussion of, let's like dial it down like one bit, like discussion of political, no, I don't mean the contentiousness. I actually mean the idea that this is like some brand new thing that like fucking like Sedgwick invented, right? No, like political emotions, like fucking Machiavelli's all up on that shit. Hobbes, and all the OG Marxists, not just Marx and Engels, but yeah, Lenin, Mao, people we've been talking about, actually have long discourses on political emotions. So I actually think that is very, very fundamental, just as you put it, Sam. And that's one of the reasons why I am so often drawn both to Fanon and also to, frankly, to what Aaron was just talking about, which is this almost like in addition to imminent critique, of almost, and again, this speaks to the hype specificity question, right? There is just like a wealth of empirical knowledge, and yet you don't want to reify it. But it is very useful. So Aaron raised this point last night that like we are living through one of the most protest-ridden ages in modern history. So it's like, it's up there, again, with the mid-century, with and so on and so forth. And many of the sociologists who write about this point out, and I think this speaks partly to what Jodi was pointing out, that there's very little institutionally that speaks to or can capture that kind of eruption, but it is happening. And one of the reasons I was like queasy a bit about giving too much social media, even though I agree, is that some of the places where those like suicide explosions are happening and people are very upset are not places that have full social media penetration. So that is very, very crucial, and I think leads to very logically to the next question, which was about questions of spirituality, I guess. Or, I mean, I always like the religion scholar in me, which that exists way, way back, always is like a little iffy about what spirituality means. Like, do you mean religion? Do we mean spirituality? Do you mean supernaturalism? There are, of course, massive traditions across the world of emancipatory, in fact, indeed explicitly Marxist and other radical movements that understand themselves as expression of forms of religion. I think of things like the most famous case would be like Gutierrez and liberation theology, but you can also think about people like Shariati, if you're interested in Islamic socialism and things like that. But I'm also always a bit skeptical, and I'll say why. I think it's good, and this is going to be necessary, and like, frankly, any politics of this moment is always going to be super messy, and that's a problem for all of us. So you're not going to like agree on everything. So like, I might not agree with someone who like had a metaphysical basis for their politics, and yet, as long as we agree on like 3 principles, we're cool. Like, it doesn't matter. But I'll say why I'm theoretically skeptical, which is simply that, I hate to be biographical, but like one half of my family comes from a country, India, that is currently run by a fascist government, and that's the proper use of the term fascism, that loves to talk about how spiritual it is. It talks about climate change as a yogi problem. It says, let's have an international day to celebrate yoga. And you know what? It helps them sell fucking fascism in the West, where people are like, oh, Indians, you're so cute and cuddly and you're into yoga. And like, it blinds us to the most blatant case of neo-fascism in the world, a literal branch group modeling itself on the SA, now is in power basically permanently in the world's largest country. Like, that is actual fascism, and it couches itself and defends itself in the name of spirituality. And the other half of my family is Jewish. And when I used to teach intro religion, I would have people read a very famous bit from the Babylonian Talmud on day 1, which is the Oven of Aknai story, which I'm not going to go through. It's very good. But one of the reasons I would teach them that is that this is a bit of one of the most like fundamental sacred texts, clearly defined, and yet it's like what God says doesn't matter. Anything supernatural doesn't matter. Like, only thing that matters is what we as a self-defined community decide, right? And how bad am I doing on my own, right? So that is a normative Jewish text, and yet it violates every understanding we have of religion that we have inherited, frankly, from Christianity. So that's why I'm skeptical there, even though I do recognize the kind of like, I think, impoverished subjectivity you're talking about. And then finally, it's very easy and a very good pivot to address this question of the sort of, it's not so, I mean, the binaries, I would also like Jodi's phrases ever so slightly differently, but also differently than Jodi did. There's never going to be, this is a contentious thing to say, but whatever. Politics, like real politics, like not just administrative disputes, but politics of consequence are never going to be perfectly pluralistic. And my example I often give to students is, because they'll be jamming on the manifesto, right? They'll be jamming on Marx and something like that. I'll be like, by the technical definition of the like Nuremberg court genocide, we all, if you ascribe to this program, you want to genocide the bourgeoisie. Not necessarily kill them, but I want to eradicate their way of life, which is one of the definitions of genocide. So therefore, if I hold to an actual political position, I want to eradicate a certain form of life. And that to me is inescapable. It's an ugly, unhappy truth that frankly, yeah, Adorno saw and then shirked from. He wanted to, like, he saw that that was possible and I turned away. He has a beautiful bit in one of his lectures called, "Is there a possibility of a global subject?" And he basically walks up to this point and then it's like, oh, no, it's going to violate Kant on this, and this, so we can't do it. And that's the like ragged edge that I think critical theory pushes us to. And on that very dreary note, I really want to thank the Goethe Institute, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, M+1, all of the panelists, everyone who helped put this together, you all. And as one final thing, we have a cocktail hour, and you'll be listening to music during this cocktail hour. And actually, this I did not know. Actually, Jodi, you're gonna love track 1 more than anyone else in the room. The very first track, I do this actually to my students in class all the time, is in fact the Soviet national anthem. And the second track is Schoenberg. And this is to think about content and form. And then each pair track is a work of the avant-garde, right, in the sort of Adornian sense, and then a work of mass media in the Benjaminian sense that incorporates and circulates the avant-garde. So as you're listening and enjoying your drinks, hopefully you can be weighing the value of the autonomy of aesthetics versus the possibilities of mass media.